I was born and grew up in Manitowoc.
I was born in Green Bay.
I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I was born in Manitowoc in 1965.
I'm Menominee from the Menominee tribe, and so I'm as original as you can be.
Well, we first moved from Milwaukee to the Two Rivers, Wisconsin. And we built a house there. That was the first house my parents owned. And my father worked for the Manitowoc shipyards. So we lived in Two Rivers, and then from there we moved to Seattle, Washington. My father got a job at the Bremerton shipyards, where they built that aircraft carrier you must have heard of, the Enterprise. He was one of the guys that helped build that first aircraft carrier. Then when that job was done, well, then we moved back to Wisconsin, and then we moved to Manitowoc.
Well, I grew up during the Depression, and at the time, as a kid growing up, we never thought we were struggling. I mean, our parents never showed it. I mean, we didn't have much, and I can remember, going to school, and on the playground they didn't have things. We didn't have gyms or anything like that. And in grade school, I can remember we had jump rope contests, and the boys did play football out of an old field behind the school. But, and then we had to work in the gardens all the time for vegetables. So, and as far as meat, we didn't ever have too much meat at the time. Like when we were kids, our entertainment was Bay Beach, and that's when you could swim there. But they never had any rides or Ferris wheels or anything back then. And we'd take hikes down the railroad tracks and pick nuts and thorn apples. And I grew up, we never had a car. In fact, I didn't have a car until we got married. We all had a bike though, and a bus. So.
Well, I did grow up during the Depression. My dad had a job, so we didn't have it as bad as a lot of other people did. And we lived with my grandpa. Years ago, there a lot of people did that. We lived with my grandma and grandpa, and I was about 8 years old when my grandma died. And my grandpa, he died after I was married.
My initial schooling was in a Christian school, a Catholic school. At that time, they were very mean to Native people. It wasn't a boarding school, but there was a lot of humiliation, a lot of physical abuse. I lost my hearing because of it. In 1 year, I was slapped by a nun in 1 year, knocked over a desk because I didn't have my hand up in the right position saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And one time I was interviewed by a guy who was writing a book about Native veterans, and he says, well, do you suffer from post-traumatic stress of being in Vietnam? And I kind of kidded with him, and I said, I have more post-traumatic stress from Catholic school than I have from being in Vietnam.
When I was about 5 or 6 years old, in the early 70s, Wisconsin wanted to build Interstate 43, and it went from Milwaukee all the way through Green Bay. And I remember how farmers were fighting against the interstate going through because it was going to take a lot of farmland. And my father lost 22 acres, and the farmers hired lawyers, and they did a bunch of protesting.
What changes? I've seen a lot of changes. I grew up in the city, and I married a farmer and moved to the country. And we didn't even have water in the house for the first 5 years I was married. We had electricity, but not water. So we had to get water out of the cistern when there was water in it, or else carried in the house from the pump. heated on the stove for washing clothes. But now with all this new technology, I mean, it's just, well, I got a computer, but I'm not the greatest on the computer either.
I mean, if you're looking at, let's say the pay, just for instance, the pay. When I was working, I got $1.75 an hour when I worked at Harley-Davidson in Milwaukee. And I thought that was just great. And when I talked to my grandpa, it's $1.75, he was only getting 10 cents. And he worked at Hamilton's in Two Rivers. And when he got a raise one time for up to 25 cents, he thought he was a king. I'm raised here, like I told you, there were jobs abundant. When I raised our kids, my two boys and my daughter, it was still the same way. There were a lot of nice jobs here. They all got part-time jobs when they were going to school. Things were still good. It was a nice small town to bring up your kids. None of them were involved in any drugs, but while they were growing up, that's when a lot of the drugs and some of the stuff was coming out in this area. But maybe probably because I was a policeman at the time, they knew better. And none of them got in any deep trouble the whole time they were growing up here. And they all left when they graduated from high school, but guess what? They all came back.
Because some of my upbringing was in Milwaukee. When you're in an urban setting like that, you had Mexican, and you had Puerto Rican, you had Cubans, and we had Polish, and we had German, and we had Irish. And back in them days, Milwaukee was actually kind of little we want to say ethnic areas. Indians lived in one area, and the blacks lived in the area. The Germans were over here, the Polish were over here, and the Mexicans were over here, and that was the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans. So there was all these little pots of different ethnic groups, and then pretty soon everybody started intermingling. But what I grew up with was, especially in the city, was not as intense racism, even though it was there in some areas. There was actually, when I came from the military and I started drinking, there was actually, when you come off the reservation, you go to Shawano, there was like 2 bars, and then there was, it was called Green Bay Street, and Main Street goes right through, goes toward Clintonville. That was actually, if you were Indian, that's where you had to stay. You actually couldn't go into other bars because you get chased out of there.
In the early 2000s, I don't actually know if it was 2001 or 2 or 3, but my father sold the farm to Outagamie County Co-op, and they built a mega gas station there. And they burned the buildings down. Everything was burnt down except one silo. They kept one silo standing. So if you come to Francis Creek and you see a silo standing in the middle of a Unimart, that's where I grew up.
I did home nursing care for people, and we raised the kids good. But we had a decent life, and my son took after my husband. They were hunters, and we always had wild meat in the house. My husband and I built our own house. It took us 2 years. We lived in the basement. So, we didn't have it too bad. We had an average living. The kids went to school, but it's nothing like now where in those days they didn't think too much about going to college. People just didn't have that kind of money. But raising 4 children and then clothes. You go down and buy the kids clothes and they wear them. And nowadays, if the parents bought the kids clothes, I don't think the kids would even want to wear them.
I taught at Cleveland School, 5th and 6th grade, for 1 semester, and I worked at Harley-Davidson Motorcycle Factory in Milwaukee for 3 years. And then I decided to move back to Manitowoc, and I got a job on the Manitowoc Police Department. and I worked there for 20 years till I retired. I like working with woodworking stuff. I'm doing the things I do in my basement. I make those pocket crosses, and I'm trying to raise money for cancer victims, and I'm a cancer survivor myself. And so if we can do anything to help people earn some money for cancer, that's one good thing I like to do.
I had hooked back up with my childhood sweetheart, and eventually we got married. I had enrolled at UWO in Oshkosh, and she was going to school in Ripon, and we both ended up quitting school and got married and started a family. And that first year I kind of just worked what was available. There was a program on the reservation called ITAC where they trained us in building trades. And so I did that for one summer, and then at the end of summer, my father-in-law got me a job at the Menominee, we called it Menominee Enterprise. It was a tribal mill. And we weren't actually a tribe then, we were terminated, so we weren't as per se. We were just going back into tribal representation. So I worked at the mill, and I did that for like 4 or 5 years. Then I went back to school, took a course in auto body repair, came out of there, and ended up finding a job as a carpenter. And I ended up being a carpenter for quite a few years. And I did other things along the way, but I always, for some reason, being a carpenter I really liked to do it. It was something I was good at, and even though I would try to change my occupation, I was always gravitated back to being a carpenter. So in fact, I still do it.
I worked in the factory of Miro Aluminum for about 7 years. Then I worked at the Manitowoc Healthcare Center for 15 years. I worked in housekeeping, and I was the activity aide.
Oh, I would like to see more jobs available for kids coming up. You worry about your grandchildren finding jobs and making their way through the world now, as tough as things are, and that's what I would like to see, that there'd be more jobs available and the country get back up on its feet again. That would be a nice thing to have.
Right now, at my age, I think Wisconsin is fine. I know they have to progress farther, and children have to be educated more. I think in our days, they didn't think about that. But I think education is the most important thing. But I wish you'd leave more space open, for people to enjoy instead of putting a big building on it. And I don't know how that would work either.
That there's not all this turmoil with the government and everything, and well, even in different countries. I mean, years ago it wasn't that the global economy affected the United States as much as it does now. I mean, it affects the stock market and everything.
Well, number one change actually pertains to this school here. Is that, this school, UWGB, was identified as being in the top 100 schools, colleges, for native students to go to. I don't see them backing that up. There's a lot more that can be done. So to me, having them changes taken care of, and the school coming forward to help us get the word across about Native studies. Things with employment, and not just for Native people, but for everybody. I mean, you have that, you always see the people, especially in government, big houses, mansions, and they got it made, and our economy is fine, and all other people suffering. See, in tribal leadership, in the old way, you took care of them people first. You took care of yourself last. In fact, in the old way of Native leadership, it was the leaders that become known as chiefs. They were the poorest because they made sure everybody had something. There was no such thing as welfare. You know, there's no such thing as being homeless. Even on our res, as bad as things are, you barely see anybody homeless. I think the biggest change that needs to take place is that the leaders of this country need to step down and say, hey, you know, we need to help everybody.
And in 1919, when the Packers were founded, my grandfather was a shoemaker. And the Packers then played behind East High School. And they had leather helmets. They looked like swimming hats. And they had vests that was made of leather, and if one of the straps broke or something, he worked for the Schuh company, and he used to do patchwork on all their uniforms. His whole family got involved with the Packers. They wouldn't miss a day that they were in town. And when my brother and I were young, they had a little area by their house. They'd park cars, and we'd get a nickel or 10 cents to park a car. And after we had them all parked and they watched the game, my brother and I run down the road and spend our 20 cents or whatever we made on candy. I mean, that was a big deal. So that's how I became involved with the Packers. And then we didn't have TV, and I can remember my mother and dad, they never had tickets, and they sat in front of the radio listening to the Packer game, and boy, that was it is, because you really had to be quiet.
When I had extra time on my hands, I decided, well, I'm going to go watch some ball games in the evenings, you know. And I ran into a guy that introduced me to Milwaukee Braves were the ball team in Milwaukee, and this guy was an umpire for baseball games, professional umpire. So I got to know him, and then I went to umpire school, and then I became a WIAA umpire for high school baseball. That was a lot of fun. And then I got to umpire softball games for the city of Manitowoc, the city of Milwaukee. And pretty soon, I was making more money on my part-time job than I was on my full-time job. I would get, just for an example, I'd get $175 for 2 weeks' work at Harley-Davidson. I was making $190 in 2 weeks umpiring. But I wish I could have gone into it professionally. But that's hard to get into it that good, you know. But I did enjoy that. That was a lot of fun.
Being a veteran, I did a lot of things I did to help veterans, especially like when I came home from Nam, there was such a bad feeling against Vietnam veterans returning home that literally when I got off the plane in California and I was being sent to be discharged, I actually got off the airplane and actually got spit on and got called names because I was returning from Vietnam. Actually, they were actually throwing dog feces in plastic bags, and they were throwing them at us as we got off after we went through the terminal at the airport. And so when I got home, I just took my stuff and put it away, and we didn't even say we were in Vietnam. That was a bad thing to say, you know. So finally, in I think it was around 1985, I want to say, to where they had the official welcome home parade for Vietnam veterans, and I stepped forward and I started working first to help myself, and then later to help other Vietnam veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress and getting into things like education programs, and you know, so I helped out in that manner, but I never really got deep into a lot of frontline things, you know, prominent things that went on.
When the interstate first come through, if people would break down in the middle of the night, we had several occasions where people would come in our barn and they'd be sleeping in the barn in the morning because they didn't have nowhere to go. People would run out of gas and they'd come to our house and On the farm, we still had some tractors that ran on gas. The rest of them ran on diesel fuel. But people would always want to borrow gas, and we let them take gas with a gas can and hope that they'd bring the gas can back. Well, a lot of them did, some didn't. We were just good-hearted that way.
But as kids, we had more fun with nothing than these kids nowadays with everything. They don't go out and do the real things in life. They depend on all these telephones and all these things. I don't know what they call them even. But they should get out and play with some of the different things.
The opportunities for you to learn are here, and I'm sure you're taking advantage of that. So you still have a nice place to finish growing up, and who knows, when you leave you might come back here someday. You never know. It's a real nice area.